This is the Holy Gospel according to St. Mark, the 4th chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. On that day, when evening had come, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. Other boats were with him. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that the boat was already being swamped. But he was asleep in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" He woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." Then the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm. He said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and sea obey him?" The Gospel of the Lord. So it was a really nice, sunny, warm day. It was actually kind of hot. And there weren't any clouds in the sky at all, and I wasn't expecting any kind of stormy weather. But suddenly, the wind kicked up. It got really loud. Things started to shake. I heard it from inside the church. So I went outside to get a better look at what was happening. And because it was kind of hot, the breeze, even the heavy wind, felt kind of nice. But as I looked out on the lake, the placid waters, which had been absolutely like a mirror, had suddenly become choppy. There were actually whitecaps starting to form on the lake. It was October of 2019, and we were on our Holy Land trip visiting Capernaum, which is right on the shoreline of the Sea of Galilee. And the lake is the same sea that Jesus and his disciples were on in today's story. So I quickly pointed out to as many people as I could find who were part of my group that this was a living example of the stories we read about in the Bible. Windstorms on the Sea of Galilee come up very quickly, seemingly out of nowhere. They quickly make life very dangerous if you're out on the lake in a small boat. And as on that day, they can suddenly stop as quickly as they start. The disciples of Jesus, most of them were fishermen. They knew these things. Even people like Jesus, who weren't fishermen, knew these things as well. And nobody on that day would have been surprised that a storm suddenly came upon them and began to swamp the boat. They were all probably prepared for something like this to happen. And yet, Jesus was sleeping in the midst of the storm. And the disciples wake him up and they ask him, "Do you not care that we are perishing?" It's sort of a melodramatic question. And it often causes people reading this story to think, well, maybe the disciples expected Jesus to miraculously make the storm stop. Which he does, but it's very clear that that's not what the disciples expected to happen. So sometimes people read this story and they think that what the disciples were really doing was that they were telling Jesus that they were literally in over their heads and needed Jesus to help them bail the boat. But they had all been through this drill before. This was not the first storm, nor the last that they would see. They knew how to deal with it, and they were probably doing just fine because they, in fact, had spare time to wake Jesus up and complain. Because if you got enough time to do that kind of stuff, you're probably doing okay with your bailing. Instead, it seems to me like the real question they're asking Jesus is, how can you sleep through this storm? How can you sleep at such a time as this? Really? How can Jesus sleep during such a storm? And then there's a follow-up question that I always want to ask. Can you teach me to do that too? I mean, really, Jesus is literally in this story the very model of non-anxious presence. Everybody is upset that the world is falling apart, but Jesus is so calm that he's able to sleep in the midst of it and continue not to be all bent out of shape because of the storm around him. How does he do it? And can he teach us to be less anxious in the midst of the storms of our lives? At first, it doesn't seem like Jesus answers that question. But then after calming the storm, Jesus asks his disciples why they're afraid. Have you still no faith? He asks them. Have you still no faith? And it's clear in that question that the faith that Jesus speaks of is not the belief that nothing really bad is going to happen to you. This storm is actually pretty bad. It's life-threatening. It's happened to you before, and it will probably happen again. No, the faith that Jesus is speaking of is not, no, don't worry, nothing bad will really happen to you. Faith is not the belief that if you have God in your life, everything will be easier. I hear a lot of that from people sometimes, and especially clergy who should know better. Oh, God will make your life so much easier. But see, here's the thing. Jesus is physically present in the boat with them. They literally have the incarnate presence of Jesus, and yet they are bailing just as hard as ever. Jesus' presence doesn't take away the difficulty of the storm. This also is not the faith that Jesus is speaking of. And the faith that Jesus is asking them about is not the faith that says storms really aren't that bad if you've got the right spiritual perspective. You know, it's all going to be good. It's not a good storm. This storm really is bad. And Jesus never tells them when he wakes up that they should have ignored the storm and not bailed the boat. This is not the faith that Jesus is asking them about. So what is it about Jesus, about his faith, about the faith that Jesus calls the disciples to, that allows him to be calm in the midst of the storm? It seems to me that what made Jesus able to be a non-anxious presence in the midst of the storm was that Jesus was secure in his connection to God. God was literally present in Jesus, and Jesus was secure in God's love and God's care. That didn't mean that Jesus was having an easy life or that God didn't send Jesus to do really hard, difficult, and painful things. But he was secure in God's presence, God's love, and God's care all the time, no matter what was happening. The disciples clearly were not sure. Even though they had the presence of God incarnate with them in the boat, they asked Jesus, "Don't you care? Maybe you see, maybe you don't, but even so, maybe you care, but maybe you don't." And partly, it's this wondering if God notices or even cares that makes the disciples unable to be calm in the midst of the storm. I think also the faith that Jesus calls the disciples to, the faith of Jesus himself, is based on the confidence in God's ability to work through people and resources that God has surrounded us with. I mean, in one sense, Jesus can sleep because he knows the disciples know what to do. He is surrounded by people who have the gifts, the talents, and the abilities to help make all of them get through this situation. Jesus knows God's with him, but he also knows he's not alone, and God has provided other people and actually other boats full of people to help him get through the storm. The disciples seem to lose sight of this. It's easy to feel alone in the midst of a storm. There are times in my life, and maybe in yours too, where I feel like I'm going through a storm and I feel like I'm isolated, I'm alone. I intellectually understand it's not true, but that's how it feels. And that's how it felt to these disciples. They were surrounded by others. They were surrounded by others who knew what they needed to do to help them and get through it, but they didn't feel they didn't feel that they were surrounded by God's love and presence there, and they didn't see God working through those other people to help them through the midst of the storm. They don't seem to be looking for or recognizing God's help in the midst of community. And instead they cry out and go, you know what, it just has to be something magical here, or we're not going to believe that God is there with us. And I think that the faith of Jesus, the faith that Jesus calls his disciples to, is based on the certainty that the storm would end. I mean, this does not take divine knowledge to figure out. The storms will always end, and on the Sea of Galilee, they often end quickly and abruptly. The storm is not all there is, and even in the midst of it, Jesus can see beyond it. The disciples don't seem to be able to do that. The storm has come upon them, and it so consumes their worldview that they cannot see that there is any life beyond this storm. And so they panic and they tell Jesus, "We're all going to die!" But that's not actually what's going to happen. And so Jesus does something that they clearly don't expect. He stops the storm. He says, "Peace, be still." But I wonder if these words aren't directed as much at the disciples as they are at the wind and the waves. After all, Jesus doesn't tell the disciples that they should not have awakened him, that they should have awakened him sooner, or that they were right to panic. "Oh yes, you should have gotten me up. Why didn't you tell me before it got this bad?" None of those things are what Jesus says. Instead, I sometimes get the sense that Jesus thinks the disciples really were managing the storm quite well. I mean, it was bad, it was hard, but they were doing what they needed to do, and they had the gifts that God needed to get them through the storm. But he also realizes that unless he calms the storm, they won't stop panicking and let him get back to sleep. So he calms the storm so that they shut up and let him go to sleep again. Now, I always feel like I am way more like the disciples than like Jesus when I am living through a storm in my life. And maybe it's sometimes like that for you too. But unlike the disciples, rather than simply be awed by Jesus' ability to calm the storm, because they don't seem to get it, they just say, "Wow, who then is this?" They miss that faith part. Somehow, maybe we should pay more attention to this faith of Jesus rather than just the awe of, "Look what Jesus did." And the faith that Jesus calls us to is not the faith that the storms won't happen to us, but rather that faith helps us to be more secure in our relationship with God. That's the kind of faith Jesus calls us to. And that means that it is, in a sense, a deeper sense that God is really with us and actively caring for us that can help us through the storms in our lives. Especially in the midst of very difficult storms, sometimes people end up cutting themselves off from God. God must not be here. I'm not even going to look for God in my life. I'm not going to look for God's presence in my life. I'm not going to look for God's help in my life. I'm just going to assume that God has abandoned me, kind of like Job in the first reading. God must have abandoned me if things are really going badly. And that never actually helps people through the storm. Often, the faith that Jesus calls us to means finding ways to deepen our connection with God through whatever helps us individually to feel God's presence, whether that's prayer, worship, reading the Bible, taking long walks to give God a chance to talk to you and explain things or help you feel His presence in your life. It's different for different people, but opening yourself up to deeper connection to God is often one of the ways that helps people to be calm in the midst of the storm. And for us too, being calm in the midst of the storm is based on the kind of faith that helps us to be confident in God's willingness and ability to work through people and resources around us to help us through our storms. Because like the disciples, it's easy to feel alone when we're in the midst of a storm in our lives, even when we know intellectually that's not true. I know I have friends around. I know I have other people who care for me. I know I have resources to help me through this. But sometimes paying attention to those people and to those opportunities can help us to see God's active work in our lives because we see other people and resources that we're given as signs and vehicles of God's help that we've been praying for to help us get through the storm. And that can help us be more confident and calmer. And for us too, the faith that Jesus calls us to is the faith that allows us to be certain that whatever storm we're in will not last, and it will not be the final word in our lives. Jesus' death and resurrection reminds us that even the storm that does actually kill us will not ultimately be the end of us. God's promise of life wins out even over death, and no storm ultimately prevails. And sometimes the faith that helps us keep that perspective can help us stay grounded and calm no matter how bad the storm gets. You know, like those first disciples, storms in our lives, they come and go, and sometimes they seem mild, and at other times they do seem like they're going to kill us. But whatever storm we find ourselves in, God's love, God's care, and God's presence really are always with us. No matter what storm we find ourselves in, God is always working in and through others to help us deal with the storm. And no matter what storm we find ourselves in, Jesus promises us that no storm will last forever, and that no storm will finally have the last word in any of our lives. Amen.